For centuries, hidden societies traded human lives for supernatural peace. Gibson Hayes became the latest currency, sold to a monster who never even looked at her. Forced into an icy marriage with a creature of nightmares, she expected death. Instead, she uncovered a secret that changed history forever. Whispers among the global elite always hinted at the true power behind the world's most untouchable dynasties. Hedge fund managers, politicians, and tech moguls all bowed to a shadow organization known only as the Sovereign Consortium. Gibson Hayes, a 23-year-old architectural archivist, knew nothing of this hidden world until her father, Richard Hayes, made a fatal miscalculation. Richard had embezzled nearly $3 billion from the wrong private equity firm front for the consortium. Facing total annihilation not just financially but physically, Richard offered the only asset he had left that the consortium's reclusive leader desired, his daughter. Gibson was completely unaware of her father's desperate bargain until the black SUVs arrived at her modest Boston apartment. Men in immaculate charcoal suits wearing earpieces and devoid of any discernible facial expressions packed her belongings. She was escorted, more accurately, abducted onto a private Gulfstream 650. Her destination was an impenetrable, sprawling estate shrouded in the dense, fog-heavy forests of the Olympic Peninsula in Washington state. Darius Montgomery was a name that commanded terrifying respect in the underworld. To the public eye, he was an eccentric billionaire, a ghost who controlled a massive pharmaceutical and real estate empire from the shadows. To those who knew the truth, he was the vampire king of the Western Hemisphere, a ruthless immortal who had ruled for over 400 years. When Gibson finally stood before him in the cavernous, dimly lit grand hall of his estate, she was trembling uncontrollably. Darius stood by a massive stone fireplace, the flames casting sharp, angular shadows across his flawless aristocratic features. He was breathtakingly handsome, with raven-black hair perfectly styled and eyes the color of striking glacial ice. He wore a bespoke Tom Ford suit that clung to his broad shoulders. Yet he possessed an aura so intensely cold and predatory that Gibson felt all the air leave her lungs. He didn't even look at her. His gaze remained fixed on the roaring fire as Richard Hayes, sweating profusely and clutching a leather briefcase, babbled his gratitude. "The debt is settled, Hayes," Darius said, his voice a low, resonant baritone that vibrated through the floorboards. It held no warmth, no emotion. "Leave, before I change my mind and take your life as interest." Richard fled without looking back at his daughter. Gibson was left standing alone, a sacrificial lamb abandoned to a predator. The marriage ceremony took place precisely at midnight. There were no flowers, no white dress, and no guests. A quiet, terrifyingly efficient consortium magistrate named Arthur Pendleton officiated the binding in the estate's private chapel. Gibson wore the simple navy dress she had been abducted in. Darius stood beside her, rigid and unmoving, leaving a deliberate 2 feet of space between them. When the time came to exchange vows, Darius didn't recite words of love. He merely extended his hand, his skin pale and flawless. Pendleton produced a silver dagger. With practiced precision, the magistrate sliced Darius's palm, then reached for Gibson's trembling hand, slicing hers as well. When Darius gripped her hand, Gibson gasped. His skin was like solid ice, completely devoid of human warmth. The blood magic sealed the union, a glowing, ephemeral scar wrapping around her ring finger before vanishing into her skin. "You will reside in the East Wing," Darius told her coldly, releasing her hand the absolute second the ritual was complete. He finally turned his glacial eyes toward her, but his gaze was vacant, looking through her rather than at her. "Your needs will be met by the staff. You are free to walk the grounds during daylight. Do not cross into the West Wing. Do not seek me out. We will live separate lives under this roof, and if you obey, you will survive." With that, he turned and vanished into the shadows of the corridor, his footsteps completely silent. Gibson was left in the cold chapel, clutching her bleeding hand, officially married to a monster who couldn't even stand the sight of her. Months dragged on, turning the Montgomery estate into a beautiful, gilded prison. Gibson's life fell into a lonely, quiet routine. She was attended to by Mrs. Gable, a stern but polite housekeeper who appeared human, and a towering head of security named Kalen, whose unnatural speed betrayed his vampiric nature. Gibson was given unlimited access to the estate's massive accounts. She could order designer clothes, rare books, gourmet food, anything money could buy. But she could not buy her freedom. Darius was a ghost. She only saw him in passing, a dark, imposing figure striding across the courtyards at dusk or disappearing into the private elevators. Whenever they accidentally crossed paths in the vast corridors, he would immediately turn his head, his jaw clenching tight, and walk in the opposite direction. It stung more than Gibson cared to admit. She was his captive, his forced bride, yet he treated her like a repulsive disease. Desperate for answers and bored out of her mind, Gibson began utilizing her skills as an archivist. She spent her days exploring the permitted areas of the sprawling mansion, eventually discovering the estate's subterranean library. The room was a treasure trove of forgotten history, filled with leather-bound tomes, first editions, and private ledgers dating back to the 1600s. It was there, tucked inside a hollowed-out volume of Dante's Inferno, that she found a collection of private letters. They belonged to a woman named Beatrice Astor, a wealthy socialite from the Gilded Age who had secretly been wed to a high-ranking consortium vampire in 1892. The letters detailed a horrific fate. Beatrice wrote of how human brides were entirely disposable, used merely as blood bags or political pawns to secure human wealth. "They do not love us," the final letter read, its ink faded and tear-stained. "They endure us until they drain us. The hunger always wins." Gibson dropped the letter, her heart pounding against her ribs. Was that her fate? Was Darius simply waiting for the right moment, starving himself before he eventually gave in and killed her? It explained his distance. It explained his refusal to look at her. He was fighting his predatory nature, biding his time. The isolation and fear reached a boiling point during the winter solstice. The consortium demanded an appearance from the Vampire King and his new human queen. The Montgomery estate was transformed into a dark, opulent venue. Hundreds of the world's most terrifying and powerful beings arrived in fleets of Rolls-Royces and Maybachs. Gibson was dressed by her maids in a sweeping, blood-red velvet gown, a diamond collar locked tightly around her throat, a stark reminder of her status as property. She stood beside Darius at the top of the grand staircase. It was the closest they had been since the wedding night. She could feel the freezing temperature radiating off his body, but also something else, a rigid, almost violent tension. His hands were clasped behind his back, his knuckles white. "Keep your eyes down," Darius muttered, his voice barely a whisper. It had sliced through the noise of the ballroom below. "Do not speak unless spoken to, and whatever you do, do not leave my side." Despite his warning, the night was chaotic. The political maneuverings of the vampire elite were dizzying. While Darius was pulled away by a faction of European aristocrats discussing territory disputes, Gibson was pushed toward the edge of the ballroom. That was when Lord Alaric Croft found her. Croft was a rival of Darius, an ancient vampire from a disgraced British lineage who despised Montgomery's rule. He cornered Gibson near the terrace doors, his smile predatory and cruel. "So this is the little human pet Darius purchased," Croft sneered, stepping impossibly close. The smell of decaying roses and copper clung to him. "Tell me, little bird, does he share? Or does he keep you locked away because he knows how fragile you are?" "Step away from me," Gibson commanded, trying to project a bravery she didn't feel. Croft laughed, a sharp, barking sound. He reached out with blinding speed, his long, razor-sharp fingernail slicing deliberately across Gibson's bare shoulder. A sharp gasp escaped her lips as a line of crimson blood welled up on her pale skin. The reaction in the room was instantaneous. The low hum of polite conversation vanished, replaced by an oppressive, terrifying stillness. Every vampire in the room caught the scent. But before Croft could even raise his bloody finger to his lips to taste it, the air itself seemed to shatter. A blur of dark movement tore through the crowd. In a fraction of a second, Darius was there. He didn't just push Croft away. He slammed the ancient vampire through the solid oak doors of the terrace, shattering the wood into 1,000 splinters. Darius's hand was clamped around Croft's throat, lifting him off the ground. The king's eyes, normally a pale, detached ice, were entirely pitch black. A terrifying, inhuman snarl ripped from his chest, vibrating the crystal chandeliers above. "You dare touch what is mine!" Darius roared, his voice a demonic echo. He threw Croft effortlessly across the stone terrace, sending the rival lord crashing into a marble fountain. Darius turned back to Gibson. He moved toward her, his chest heaving, his fangs fully descended. The entire ballroom held its breath, expecting the king to finish what Croft started, to drain the bleeding human in a fit of bloodlust. Gibson froze, terrified. The blood was running down her arm, warm and bright. Darius stopped mere inches from her. His black eyes locked onto the wound. He was shaking, a violent, full-body tremor. The hunger in his expression was undeniable, monstrous and raw. He reached a hand out, his freezing fingers hovering just millimeters over her bleeding skin. Gibson squeezed her eyes shut, waiting for the bite. Instead, she felt the soft, incredibly gentle brush of a silk handkerchief against her shoulder. Darius was pressing his own pocket square to the wound, absorbing the blood. He wasn't looking at her face. His eyes were squeezed tightly shut in agony, his jaw locked so hard it looked ready to fracture. "Kylan," Darius choked out, his voice strained to the breaking point. "Take my wife to her chambers, now, before I kill everyone in this room." He turned away from her so violently, he nearly knocked over a table, fleeing into the darkness of the estate, leaving Gibson staring after him, completely bewildered. He hadn't hurt her, he had protected her, almost at the cost of his own sanity. The Cold King wasn't avoiding her because he hated her. He was avoiding her because her very existence pushed his legendary control to the absolute brink. Days turned into agonizing weeks following the violent incident at the winter solstice. The atmosphere within the Montgomery estate shifted from suffocatingly quiet to dangerously volatile. Gibson noticed the subtle, terrifying changes. The estate's perimeter security had tripled. Kaelin, the towering vampire guard, now stood at the end of her hallway every night, a silent, unmoving sentinel. But the most alarming change was the complete disappearance of the king himself. Darius Montgomery had vanished into the sealed confines of the West Wing, and a creeping, chilling intuition told Gibson he was slowly starving to death. Desperation breeds reckless courage. One evening, while a torrential Pacific Northwest storm battered the estate's heavy windows, Gibson decided to break the one absolute rule Darius had given her. She slipped past Kaelin, who was distracted by a security breach at the southern gate, and navigated the labyrinthine corridors toward the forbidden West Wing. The air grew noticeably colder the deeper she ventured. Heavy velvet drapes absorbed all sound, making her footsteps feel loud and intrusive. She finally reached the massive, iron-reinforced doors of his private study. They were slightly ajar. Pushing them open, Gibson stepped into a room that looked less like a billionaire's office and more like a war room. Maps of global financial districts were pinned to the walls, intersecting with ancient, hand-drawn territorial lines of vampire clans. But what caught her attention was the massive mahogany desk in the center of the room. It was covered in scattered files, medical readouts, and heavy, aged texts. Gibson approached the desk, her heart hammering against her ribs. Lying open in the center was a thick dossier bearing the unmistakable, authentic wax seal of the Vatican's secret archives. Resting right next to a highly classified genetic sequencing report from a real-world private intelligence firm, Aegis Defense Services. Her hands trembled as she touched the documents. Right at the top of the Aegis report was a photograph. It was her. Gibson scanned the dense, heavily redacted text. The documents didn't discuss her father's embezzlement. They discussed her blood. According to the Vatican ledgers and the modern DNA sequencing, Gibson was not just a random human pawn. She was the last living descendant of a suppressed, ancient bloodline, stemming from the medieval house of Plantagenet, a genetic anomaly known in the underworld as the Rosetta strain. The texts described how the blood of this specific lineage acted as an absolute cure for the degenerative, madness-inducing decay that plagued ancient vampires. To a creature like Darius, her blood was not just food. It was the ultimate intoxicating drug, a mythical elixir that would grant immense, unparalleled power, but at the cost of consuming the host entirely. "I explicitly commanded you to never enter this wing." Gibson spun around, dropping the Vatican file. Darius stood in the doorway. He looked utterly devastated. The immaculate, terrifying king was gone. His tailored shirt was unbuttoned at the collar, his dark hair disheveled, and his skin was a terrifying, translucent shade of porcelain. Deep, bruised shadows ringed his glacial eyes, which were currently dilated and filled with a raw, agonizing hunger. He was clutching the doorframe so tightly the solid oak was splintering under his grip. "You didn't buy me because of my father's debt," Gibson whispered, her voice shaking as she backed away from the desk. "You bought me because of what I am." Darius closed his eyes, a shudder ripping through his massive frame. "Your father, Richard, was a fool. He didn't just steal money. He attempted to auction your medical files to the highest bidder at the Bohemian Grove Summit last year. He had no idea what he possessed, only that the elite consortium members would pay billions for a unique biological asset. Lord Alaric Croft was prepared to purchase you, lock you in a subterranean facility, and harvest you for the next 50 years until your body gave out." Gibson felt the blood drain from her face, sickening realization washing over her. "So you outbid them. You called in the debt to take me first." "I took you to hide you," Darius snarled, pushing off the doorframe and taking a slow, agonizing step into the room. He kept his distance, his posture rigidly defensive. "I bound you to me in blood, so no other vampire could legally claim you under consortium law. I gave you the East Wing. I ordered you to stay away from me because your scent— God, Gibson, your scent is a poison that is tearing my mind apart." It was the first time he had almost used her name, though he caught himself, the word stumbling out in a jagged breath. The coldness, the cruelty, the absolute indifference. It had all been a performance. A desperate failing barricade to protect her from his own predatory nature. "You're starving yourself," she realized, tears pricking her eyes. "You haven't fed since the wedding. If I feed on a human now, with your scent in my home, my control will snap. I will come to your chambers, and I will not stop until I have drained every drop of life from your veins," Darius confessed, his voice a low, broken rasp. He dropped to one knee, a proud king brought low by centuries of restraint, finally collapsing. "Leave this room, lock your door, because I do not know how much longer I can fight the monster inside me." Before Gibson could take a step toward him, a deafening explosion rocked the estate. The heavy blast windows of the study shattered inward, raining thick tempered glass across the Persian rugs. The wards had fallen, the consortium had arrived. Treachery rarely announces itself politely. The explosion was followed by the blaring shriek of the estate's perimeter alarms, quickly silenced as the power grid was violently severed. Emergency crimson lighting bathed the study in a hellish bloody glow. Kalen materialized in the doorway, his usually immaculate suit torn, black blood streaming from a gash on his forehead. "My king," the guard panted, his fangs fully descended. "It's a massive breach." Lord Croft rallied the extremist factions of the Aegis Council. They bypassed the biometric locks using inside codes. "They aren't here for a siege, they are here for the girl." Darius rose from the floor, and the transformation was terrifying to witness. The weakened, starving man vanished, replaced instantly by the ancient apex predator who had ruled the Western Hemisphere for 4 centuries. His eyes turned entirely pitch black. The temperature in the room plummeted so rapidly that frost loomed across the mahogany desk. "Take her to the subterranean vault," Darius commanded Kalen, his voice vibrating with lethal authority. He didn't look at Gibson. He couldn't afford the distraction. "Seal the titanium doors. If anyone but me tries to enter, execute them." "No," Gibson said, finding a sudden, ironclad resolve she didn't know she possessed. She stepped out from behind the desk. "If Croft knows I'm here, a vault won't stop him. He'll tear this estate down to the bedrock. You will do as you are told." Darius roared, spinning to face her. Before he could forcefully carry her away, the hallway outside erupted into chaos. 4 consortium assassins moving with blurring, unnatural speed breached the corridor. Kylan intercepted the first 2, tackling them through the drywall into the adjoining gallery in a brutal clash of fangs and claws. Darius stepped in front of Gibson, shielding her completely. The remaining 2 assassins lunged. Darius caught the first by the throat and simply crushed it, tossing the body aside like a broken doll. The second assassin, however, was a diversion. From the shadows of the shattered window, Lord Alaric Croft dropped into the room. He wielded a long, curved blade forged from blackened steel, a weapon heavily coated in silver nitrate and white phosphorus, highly lethal to their kind. Moving faster than Gibson's eyes could track, Croft lunged, not at Darius, but at her. Darius threw himself backward to intercept. He took the blow meant for Gibson. The poisoned blade drove deep into his chest, just inches from his heart. The king let out an agonizing, unearthly roar. The silver nitrate burned through his tissue like acid, smoke pouring from the wound. He struck Croft with a devastating backhand, sending the British lord crashing into the stone fireplace, but the damage was done. Darius collapsed onto the glass-strewn floor, gasping, the dark veins on his neck turning a sickly ashen grey. His starvation had left him too weak to heal from a poisoned strike. Croft slowly stood up, dusting off his tailored coat with a sickening smile. He looked at Darius writhing on the floor, then turned his greedy, crimson eyes to Gibson. "Such a tragedy," Croft purred, stepping over the dead assassin. "The great king brought low because he refused to dine on his own exquisite banquet. I, however, will not make the same mistake. I will drain you dry, little bird, and with the power of the Rosetta strain, I will burn the Aegis Council to ash and rule the ashes." Gibson backed away, her heel hitting the edge of the mahogany desk. Her hand brushed against something cold and sharp. It was the heavy brass letter opener she had knocked over earlier, forged in the shape of a dagger. She looked at Croft, then down at Darius, who was struggling to rise, his life force fading rapidly. He was dying because he had chosen to starve rather than hurt her. He was dying because he had protected her. "You want my blood?" Gibson said, her voice eerily calm despite the terror threatening to consume her. Croft laughed. "I will take it whether you offer it or not." "Then watch me give it away," she whispered. Gibson gripped the brass blade and slashed it fiercely across her own forearm. A deep, agonizing cut opened and bright crimson blood spilled forth. The scent hit the room like a physical shockwave. Croft froze, his eyes widening in pure primal intoxication, temporarily paralyzed by the overwhelming power of the scent. Gibson dropped to her knees beside Darius. The king's black eyes were clouding over with death, but his nostrils flared wildly as the scent of the Rosetta strain reached him. "Drink," Gibson commanded, pressing her bleeding arm directly against his pale, trembling lips. Darius violently turned his head away, choking on his own dark blood. "No, I will kill you. Drink." She screamed, tears finally spilling down her cheeks. "If you don't, we both die right now. Do it." With a tortured, feral groan, Darius surrendered. He grabbed her arm, his grip like a steel vise, and sank his fangs into her flesh. The sensation was not painful. It was an explosive, blinding rush of adrenaline and heat. Gibson gasped as she felt her life force pulling away, flowing directly into the monster she had sworn to hate. But as he drank, the transformation was miraculous. The ashen gray of Darius's skin vanished, replaced by a radiant, terrifying vitality. The gaping, poisoned wound in his chest knit itself back together in a matter of seconds, pushing the silver nitrate out of his system in a hiss of black smoke. He didn't drain her. The moment he felt the poison leave his body, he violently tore himself away from her arm, gasping for air as if he had been drowning. He had tasted the ultimate addiction, yet he found the impossible strength to stop. Darius rose from the floor. He was no longer just the vampire king. He radiated an aura of pure, ancient, unstoppable godhood. The power of the Plantagenet blood coursed through his veins, making his eyes burn with a terrifying luminescent silver light. Croft realized his fatal error a second too late. He turned to run toward the shattered window. Darius didn't just chase him. He seemed to manipulate the shadows themselves, appearing instantaneously in front of Croft. There was no grand speech, no gloating. Darius simply reached out, grabbed Croft by the jaw, and twisted. The sickening crack of the ancient vampire's neck breaking echoed through the quiet room. Darius effortlessly tossed the lifeless body out of the shattered window into the raging storm below. Silence descended upon the study, save for the howling wind and the heavy, ragged breathing of the king. The remaining invaders outside the estate, sensing the sudden, godlike surge of power and the death of their leader, fled into the night. Darius stood by the window for a long time, his broad back facing Gibson as he fought to bring the surging violent power under control. Slowly the silver light faded from his eyes, replaced by the familiar glacial ice only. Now, the ice was melting. He turned around and walked back to where Gibson sat on the floor, clutching her bleeding arm. The distance he had so carefully maintained between them for months was gone. He dropped to his knees right in front of her, uncaring of the glass digging into his trousers. Very gently, he reached out and took her injured arm. His touch was no longer freezing, it was surprisingly, comfortingly warm. He produced a clean silk handkerchief from his coat and carefully, tenderly bound the wound. When he finished, he didn't pull away. He kept his hands wrapped around hers, his thumbs gently stroking her knuckles. He finally lifted his head, and for the first time since she had arrived at the estate, he truly looked at her. The walls were gone, the predatory mask was shattered. In his eyes, Gibson saw profound regret, overwhelming relief, and an agonizingly deep, centuries-old loneliness. He leaned in, resting his forehead against hers. The man who ruled the shadows, the monster who struck terror into the hearts of the global elite, let out a shaky, vulnerable breath. "Gibson," he whispered. It was the first time he had ever spoken her name. It wasn't a command, and it wasn't a threat. It was a surrender. In the ruins of the shattered study, bound by blood and the terrifying truth, the cold king had finally found his queen. Did Gibson and Darius's perilous romance leave you breathless? The dangerous world of the Sovereign Consortium is just beginning, and there are far more dark secrets lurking in the shadows of the elite. If you loved this dramatic vampire romance, please smash that like button. Share the story with your friends and subscribe to the channel so you never miss the next thrilling chapter of their immortal journey.